Focusing the spotlight on the suffering of men sexually abused in conflict and wartime all over the world. The silent victims who've been ignored for years, the hundreds of thousands of them. Why don't we know about them? What does the world need to do to provide legal resources, moral and psychological support to men suffering these abhorrent crimes? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Hundreds of thousands of men have been raped by men. Some of them gang raped, some of them repeatedly, and some for many years. A sex crime so common, the numbers almost equal that of female victims during war times. It's the double taboo with hidden victims, and it is a secret so well kept even the UN is accused of overlooking it. Occasionally it hits the headlines when photographs of sexual abuse emerge of Iraqi men at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq in 2006. But thousands of cases remain unreported, denied by both the victim and the perpetrator. It's a tool for torture and humiliation. Rape, not least of men during wartime, is used to silence the enemy. So why is a crime so serious being ignored and unpunished? In some parts of the world, rape against men is not even recognized as a crime, defined only as forced homosexuality. But there are other factors. Firstly, there is the assumption that sexual violence, particularly rape, only happens to women and girls. The stigma attached to the crime means it's often denied by both victim and assailant. And the strict definition of gender roles in some societies means victims feel that they'll be ostracized by the community and rejected by their families. Okay, let's jump straight into this subject. Talk to my guest from London, Will STORR, contributing writer for The Guardian newspaper. STORR wrote the article, The Rape of Men, for The Guardian's Observer paper. In New York, LARA STEMPLE, Director of Health and Human Rights Law Project at UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles. From Geneva, Louise Orban, Deputy Director in the Division of International Protection at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And joining us via broadband from Kitgum, Uganda, Chris DOLAN, Director of the Refugee Law Project, an organisation set up to provide legal aid to asylum seekers in Uganda. The RLP also offers counselling to victims of rape, including men. Ms. Stemple, I know that you've spent a lot of time with the victims and the perpetrators across many parts of the world. Tell us about your findings and how prevalent this is.
Unfortunately, we see that the problem is quite common. There has been extensive research done only recently. Two findings reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association found the following. In Liberia, for example, researchers found that 42% of female combatants and 32% of male combatants had experienced conflict-related sexual violence. So while we see that females in that particular part of the world were disproportionate victims, the spread, in fact, is much smaller than I believe most of us would have anticipated. Similarly, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the eastern part of the country, the same researchers found there that looking at the general population, 22% of all men were reporting conflict-related sexual violence, in contrast to 30% of all women. So again, a small spread and a very disturbingly large number of both male and female victims.
And tell us what constitutes rape and sexual violence against men. What is it?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, there is no universal definition of rape, and there is quite a lot of variation. So we see a range of things that are more like sexual humiliation, as we saw in Abu Ghraib, committed at the hands of UN forces, forced nudity, forced masturbation, stacking naked detainees in pyramid formation. We saw in the former Yugoslavia situations of forced incest, forced fellatio, and of course traditionally rape, and including gang rape and incredibly brutal instances. So it is unfortunately a harm that runs the gamut.
Mr. STORR, you wrote the article on rape. You did a lot of research in Africa. Tell us what your findings were and what possibly shocked you the most.
I think just the extent of the brutality that these poor men had been subjected to is a thing that shocked me initially. I mean, these are men who have been kidnapped and held for months, sometimes years, raped again and again and again, daily, sometimes twice daily, 3 times daily, by queues of men, literally queuing up behind them. And when they were too weak to carry on, they'd be lifted up by the hips and forced to carry on that way. So I mean, it's a manner of torture that simply beggars belief. I mean, it's horrific. And then when you bear in mind that these people have frequently escaped under very dangerous conditions and somehow got themselves over the border to Uganda, where they're relatively safe, and the situation there is such that they can't frequently tell what's happened to their wife or family, to their brothers, to their friends, for fear of being ejected from the family. And they can't even get help from organisations such as the UN and NGOs in the area, because they seem to be geared up and equipped only to help women. So, I mean, really, the non-stop kind of litany of pain and punishment these men have been through really is quite staggering.
Ms. Orban, how come these victims can't turn to you, can't turn to the UN to get help, as Mr. STORR highlighted there?
I'm not quite sure I would agree that they can't get help, but necessarily different contexts in which we work, whether in an emergency context or what we might call a protracted refugee situation, call upon different partnerships and responses. From a protection approach point of view, UNHCR ensures to have a very inclusive approach to protection responses, whether we're speaking of preventive measures, identification, or response per se in terms of services, from legal services to health services, for instance. There's no question that interview skills or registration methodologies need to be on the lookout for the diversity of our survivors, and that needs to be kept in check. In terms of crafting responses or services for different segments of the population, we also need to ensure that not just women, children, men, boys, different ages, regardless of gender, can also have access to different services.
Ms. Orban, if the majority of UN treaties don't even acknowledge this problem, surely that means you're not taking this seriously.
I can't, UNHCR has, obviously we work under UN frameworks and international legal frameworks, but our tools to be able to respond and from a protection perspective all look at sexual and gender-based violence, regardless of gender and age. I was speaking of the age, gender, and diversity approach to our protection work, and we use this approach to be very inclusive in what we provide in terms of protection. We also work within domestic legal frameworks, and sometimes there we might find challenges to ensure that there's appropriate legal response for some of our survivors, and that may include men and boys. But generally speaking, in terms of the services that we put at the disposal of survivors and the way we interact and ensure to include different segments of society and communities in protection of communities, we engage with all.
Mr. DOLAN, do you think that the UN is doing enough? Are they engaged enough? I mean, you deal with so many of the victims.
Yeah, I would have to say I don't really agree with the previous speaker on this matter. I think certainly in terms of service provision that we see in Uganda, it's very much directed towards women. Where we want to make referrals of men, we have a lot of problems. And I think it's not just about the direct service provision. I think the whole way in which gender has been, gender-based violence has been understood within the UN has been totally women-centric. And as Lisa said earlier, when you actually start to understand what's going on by talking to survivors, the discrepancies of the difference between the numbers of men and the numbers of women affected are not as large as we generally anticipate. So the almost complete absence of services for men is a really big problem. It's a very big gap. And as I say, it's part of a bigger way in which gender is thought about. We work closely with the UN on a number of different projects. And in terms of peace building work, where we have engaged on peace building work, it's understood that gender-based violence issues are issues facing women and girls, and it's quite difficult to bring men into that discussion and to get service delivery organizations to think through that lens as well.
Mr. STORR, you were nodding in agreement to that?
Yeah, I mean, that was very much the impression I got from speaking not only to Chris, whose kind of efforts in this area have been nothing short of heroic, but also LARA STEMPLE, who another real guest. But since the piece was published in The Observer on the 17th, one of the academics who authored the study, which he referred to, the JAMA study, which found that 22% of men in the region had suffered conflict-related sexual violence, she emailed me to say, thank you for the piece, because she said, you would not believe the derision that I've suffered from NGO colleagues since I tried to highlight this as a problem. So, I mean, the evidence that I have seen very much points to a real cultural problem within the UN and with the NGOs in general, which sees, in Lara's words, men as a monolithic perpetrator class that identifies men with the bad guys and women with the good guys, and it's kind of this shallow black and white thinking which has ended up with the problems that we're seeing now.
So let's take a closer look at the problem and just broaden it out a bit as well. Despite the lack of official figures, a number of NGOs have indicated that 22% of men in eastern Congo fall victim to rape compared to 30% of women. And Ms. Stemple brought up some of these numbers. During the Bosnian conflict, 80% of Bosnian males imprisoned in concentration camps are reported to have been raped. In Sri Lanka, 21% of the men involved in the fighting reported they'd been raped during the civil war. In El Salvador, 76% of male political prisoners surveyed in the 80s reported at least one incident of sexual torture. Now, these are just a few examples, but sexual violence against men is not limited to a war crime. In recent times, sexual abuse of migrant workers, particularly labourers in the Gulf, is an underreported, often unpunished crime. Rape and torture of prisoners by police has also been reported in a number of countries. And there was the Catholic Church's latest scandal of sexual abuse of young boys across the globe. I mean, Ms. Stemple, it seems that everybody is doing it. Why is this such a popular weapon?
Well, the reason that it's a popular weapon is it's quite successful in humiliating and traumatizing the enemy. I would just add to the contexts that you gave, the situation in prisons and jails and other forms of detention. We see incredibly high numbers in those contexts as well. Part of the problem is coming from the United Nations itself. At the very highest levels, the international language that we see in these agreed upon instruments simply ignores sexual violence against men and boys. So we have the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on its face introduces harms by first talking about women and children. The moment that sexual violence is introduced, the language switches to women and girls, so even boys are excluded. Subsequent Security Council resolutions have gotten a little better by including women and children, but still we see that men are completely excluded. We see that in the canon of international human rights law as well. There are over 100 uses of the term violence against women in treaties, consensus documents, resolutions, and the like, and virtually none that address sexual violence against men and boys. So when you see this exclusion at these very high levels, it's no surprise that this trickles down. Now, I'm heartened to hear that there are groups on the ground that are at least beginning to try to provide services to these men, but until the United Nations improves its language and moves away from these very outdated assumptions against men as bad guys and women as victims, we won't make progress. And in my view, this is also harmful for women and girls because, as I say, it promotes very outdated stereotypes.
Ms. Orban, what is your response to that? I mean, if the UN is not able to hold the moral high ground here, how is anything going to be achieved?
Well, I think as a service provider, UNHCR, protection agency, there's no question in my mind that we need to look at the entire population when we're devising preventive tools or responses. And we've been looking at men and boys as both potential survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, but also as agents of protection. So engaging with male community leaders or religious leaders has been an integral part of preventive strategies, and engaging with communities on what is protection. Gender equality is also one of the mainstays of our sexual and gender-based violence strategies.
But what
There's
about
no
some sort of
question that I think
legal
we-
framework to deal with this?
Well, UNHCR works in country operations with its own domestic legal framework. We don't work outside this. Obviously, we promote international standards, and that's where we come in. Like I say, as a service provider, the focus of our work is with all as a human rights issue. Sexual and gender-based violence touches all segments of society, unfortunately. So when we're looking, let's say, at a refugee camp or the refugee population, we're looking at risks plaguing all refugees, and then craft responses that are tailored to the needs.
Okay, Mr. Dolan, what do you make of that? Because it seems to me that as long as male victims are being ignored, then the impact of this abuse against them will never really be known. I mean, what the sort of impact that it's having on society is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I think one of the paradoxes of this this silence is that it in turn it contributes to other forms of violence which agencies are concerned about. So we get a lot of concern with domestic violence against women and girls, but the linkages between that domestic violence and the possibility that the men who are perpetrating it are themselves being victimized sexually and otherwise is never explored. So when you look at the gender-based violence programming, it's always dealing with the symptoms. It doesn't go back to what brought about those behaviors in the first place.
Because surely unconvicted rapists are a danger to society, whether the perpetrator works for the church or works for some army.
Well, absolutely, but those institutions have many mechanisms in place to keep the silence, and we've seen it again and again in research, say in the Eastern Congo, where the church has been responsible for the abuse. They have simply moved the perpetrator sideways, and nobody is able to hold them to account. And I think we're seeing similar things even, say, in the abuse scandals in the US and so on. And with the army, I think, with military bodies in general, I think the same tends to happen, that the institution closes around the perpetrator and moves them sideways. And there is no public accountability. So, at best, that person will be taken to a court-martial. And that court-martial will probably not be public knowledge. And the outcome will not necessarily be public knowledge. So there is no accountability from those big authority structure.
Mr. STORR, from your research, give us a sense of what drives the perpetrators. Is there some sort of sexual satisfaction, or is it just a power game?
Well, I mean, this is a fascinating question, and it's one that I asked, I think, everybody that I came across when I was on the ground in Uganda. And unfortunately, there's been very little research, as far as I know, into this area. I mean, there are lots of sort of very interesting questions. Obviously, homosexuality itself is extremely taboo in large parts of Africa, certainly this part of Africa. So it raises the question, are some of these perpetrators closeted gay men who are using the conflict as some kind of way of acting out their behavior? I mean, their behaviours. I mean, that's one question. I mean, another question is, I mean, is this simply a power thing? Is it possible to be sexually aroused by acts of violence? I mean, these are very difficult areas. Very
that seems to be the key, doesn't it? The
on.
fact that, excuse me interrupting, that so many of the men who are abused experience some kind of sexual arousal that's more a physical thing than a mental thing or a desire. And that is what stops them from reporting this, because they feel guilty. They think, maybe I am gay, maybe I've got a problem.
Absolutely. I mean, I absolutely agree. But again, I mean, it's a very, very difficult and very complex area, and one which I am probably not qualified to speak on too much. It's probably more of a question for a very specialist psychologist.
Ms. Stemple, what are your findings of the long-term impact of being raped by a man and how that trickles through to society?
Well, I agree with Will that it's incredibly complicated. I would add to his point about male victims experiencing some type of a sexual arousal during the attack. This is obviously incredibly devastating for many victims who question whether they may have wanted it, but we find again and again that it's just a normal physiological response, and because of the stigma related to homosexuality, this does further shame them. In terms of the perpetrators and their sexual orientation, what we find in many other contexts, for example, in prisons, it's very often the perpetrators who maintain a heterosexual identity, even though they are the ones who have initiated the act. So they are taking on a position of dominant masculinity, and they are feminizing their victims. So that's why, in many ways, I see this actually as a women's issue, or certainly as a gender equality issue. It still is the feminized position that is the subjugated one, the disrespected one, and the shameful one. And those perpetrators are not, there's a myth about perpetrators as being somehow gay predators. In fact, they're not. They typically identify as heterosexual.
How do you deal with it in areas like the UAE, for example, where homosexuality is not even recognized? It's rather known as forced homosexuality, where male rape is not even acknowledged to be a crime.
We are at the very early stages of dealing with this. I often see this issue being at the point in time where we were concerning sexual violence against women and girls maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, where it was so stigmatized it was rarely talked about, where the victims were the ones who were blamed. So we have to do the exact kind of work that the international women's human rights movement did, which is to bring up this topic, bring it to the table, force the United Nations to acknowledge it, to address it. There's an incredible amount of work to be done. But I would add that it's actually quite simple. So we see in many parts of the world that there are sex-neutral definitions of rape. It's treated as something that could happen to anyone. So the UN needs to be doing the same thing. We do see that in international criminal law, there is some progress on this front. So the Rome Treaty that established the International Criminal Court does use a sex-neutral definition of rape. So it's very simple to do. The changes just need to be made.
Mr. Dolan, if this issue is not taken seriously in all areas, whether it's the army, by the government, I know it's very difficult to get response from many of the African governments where this is happening, what do you think the long-term impact is going to be on society? Where will we be 10 years from now?
Well, I think it's absolutely key to get this sorted out if you want to address the ongoing cycles of violence more generally. The cycles of violence that we've seen in the Great Lakes, for example, have been characterized by all of these patterns of sexual violence against women and against men. And the failure to address them in their entirety means that lots of elements keep perpetuating themselves. So I see it as absolutely core to serious peace building, serious conflict resolution.
Ms. Stemple, the UN hasn't come out too well out of this conversation. What sort of changes do you think we are likely to see going forward?
I don't know what we're likely to see. In part, historically we can understand this because the United Nations ignored the human rights of women in the early decades of the human rights movement following World War II. So women's issues just simply weren't on the agenda. When the international women's human rights community organized in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s and said that it's finally time for the United Nations to take women's concerns seriously, one of the main issues that they used to garner attention was sexual violence against women. So it's clearly an important issue. Women are clearly still suffering all over the world, and there's much work to be done.
Ms. Orban, are we going to see a change in UN policy, possibly?
More than UN policy, I think it's also a question of operational efficiency in terms of interview skills of our staff in the field and our NGO partners able to look for often overlooked segments of populations at risk of sexual and gender-based violence. So much more than policy, we're developing training tools, we're developing registration and interview skills, methodologies that are able to seek out different segments at risk of sexual and gender-based violence, children being one of them, one of those groups, disabled people just as well, but the sexual abuse of men, sexual abuse of boys, particularly in forced displacement situations, is an appalling situation. There's no question that we're taking this very seriously.
Okay, well, that's certainly good news, because appalling situation it is. Thank you very much for talking to us. All for you in London, Will STORR, in New York, Laura STEMPLE, in Geneva, Louise Orban, and via broadband from Kitgum, Uganda, Chris DOLAN. And as always, thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye.